Okay, hi Year 12, hope you're all well. Today we are going to be following on from Monday's work, that sort of initial kind of backlash that happens on Edgar's death and kind of the succession crisis that precipitates that. So today we're going to find out a little bit more about that crisis, so to have a look at who's on each side, what actually happens, how serious is it, and then we're going to look at how it ends, which is perhaps unsurprisingly, given that it's the Anglo-Saxon period, it ends with someone being murdered. So we're going to have a look at who it is that's murdered, perhaps who did it, why it would have happened, and then kind of set the scene ready for the Vikings to come back next lesson. So, keyword today is one that you probably do already know this word, but just in case you don't, is the word martyr. Now, what martyr means, it's someone who basically dies for what they believe in. So, Jesus Christ is the ultimate martyr because he dies for being a Christian. He believes that strongly that he dies for it, and obviously that's something that yeah, you see happening a lot through history. Lots of saints are often martyrs. So if you remember King Edmund of East Anglia, who gets shot full of arrows by the Great Heathen Army, he is revered as a martyr because he died for his Christian faith. That's just what it means. All right, it doesn't have to be Christianity, but obviously in this case, it most common is. Okay, so normally this person is admired for the life that they have given in pursuit of their noble goal or whatever it may be. Okay. So the major events happening today is at a place called Corfe Castle, which is just here, okay, in Dorset, very close to Wareham, which you'll remember from all the various Viking attacks that happened back in Edward's reign, Alfred's reign, a while ago now. Okay, Corfe Castle, it wasn't a castle at the time. Anglo-Saxons didn't have castles, as we know. They had burhs, but these days it looks a little bit like this. So it did eventually become what we might think of as an actual castle. So let's remind ourselves what that key issue was on Monday. Okay, our next king is Athelred, known as Athelred the Unready. However, he doesn't become king immediately on Edgar's death because he has an older brother, this guy here, Edward, who is called Edward the Martyr for reasons that will hopefully become clear very soon. So the issue with these two guys, if you remember, was that Edgar was a little bit of a ladies' man, and there was some question marks as to the parentage of Edward, the eldest son. Either he was the son of a woman called Wulfrith, who Edgar had had a bit of a fling with when he was younger and never actually married, or he was the son of someone called Athelflaed and Ada, Athelflaed the White, who he was basically too closely related to for that marriage to be legal either. So either way, Edward is potentially not a legitimate heir, which means he cannot inherit the throne. Athelred, meanwhile, he's only about 9, 10 years old at the time. He's very, very young, but his mum Alfrith was definitely married to Edgar, so he has that going for him. Now, so essentially, we have two little boys here. It's very similar to what we see with Edgar and his brother when they're young. It's two young boys who end up kind of in the middle of this war between two factions who get a hold of the heirs and use them to forward their own position. Okay, so in this case, one group gets a hold of Edward and the other group gets a hold of Athelred, and they use that to push their cause as to why they should be in power. So, essentially, the way it works is Dunstan and Oswald, so Oswald of York, Dunstan of Canterbury, bloody Dunstan, we all remember Dunstan, they grab Edward, the eldest son. Okay, even though there's some question marks over legitimacy, as I've said, he is the older boy, he's 13 or so, he's therefore the obvious successor. Okay, so they grab a hold of him, get him crowned, get on board with him, and they are joined by Athelwine of East Anglia, who you may remember. You may remember Athelstan Half King, that big powerful ealdorman from East Anglia. Athelwine is his son, which means he's Edgar's foster brother. Okay, so they get a hold of the eldest son. However, obviously, as we know, Dunstan has not been many people's favourite person for quite some time. Okay, Edgar was able to steamroll that reform through because he was such a powerful and feared king. However, Edgar's out the way now, so perhaps it's time to undo that reform. And all the nobles that hate monastic reform get a hold of the younger son so that they can use him to promote their claims. And I'm saying what we end up with is basically a civil war between these two factions, each of whom has a little boy at their head, or certainly being used as a figurehead, and it, as I say, it pretty much ends up in open warfare. So this is broadly the division, as I said. We've got Dunstan Oswald, who we know. We've got Athelwine of East Anglia. Okay, and we've got Bertnoth of Essex. Okay, and they are the pro-reformers, the Team Edward. All right, they want reform to continue. Okay, they've already obviously made quite a lot of headway under Edgar, and they want to keep pushing. Meanwhile, on the other side, we've got Team Athelred, so the younger son. Okay, he is being pushed by Alderman Alfhere of Mercia. So obviously this area, and possibly Alderman Oslac of Northumbria. The reason I say possibly will become clear in a minute, but we're not 100% sure, because basically what happens, if you might remember when we looked at that source last lesson, is Oslac gets exiled right at the start of Edward's reign, as soon as Edgar dies. Now we don't know why he was exiled, but it would seem to make sense that it was somehow connected to these events. Right, so possibly Oslac, but definitely Alfhere. And their goal is to get their land back. All right, we know that monastic reform involved taking land away from lots of secular landowners. All right, whether that's through expanding monasteries, handing out control of ship soaks to people, but it essentially involved lots of people losing their position, and lots of nobles being kicked out because they were secular clergy, lots of other landowners losing their lands, their power. Worcester, which was Oswald's bishopric, is in Mercia, so it's particularly that area that they're interested in. They want their land back. As I say, this basically descends into open fighting. Okay, so all the monasteries in Mercia that have been reformed are sacked. Alfhere uses his army to attack them. If you remember, sacking means violently attacking, sort of, killing inhabitants, burning things down, stealing things, destroying. The kind of antics the Vikings used to get up to back in the good old days, but it is now Alfhere leading his own troops to sack these monasteries. He also intimidates the abbots, so the sort of chief monks at an abbey. They are intimidated. In some cases, they run away, leave the country. And meanwhile, on a smaller scale, landowners are being encouraged to make lots of legal claims. Okay, to make lots of put in lots of sue them basically and say that it's their land and it's been taken from them. Meanwhile, the reformers with Edward, they're trying to keep pushing their religious reform, keep that program moving. So, a couple of tasks I would like you to do. Okay, task number one is I've given you a map that looks like this. Okay, but it has those reformist factions and anti-reformist factions highlighted on it. Either side of the map is a table with various headings such as key figures, methods, etc. Okay, I would like you to use that to pull out the key details for each faction, so you've got that recorded. So who is part of each faction, what are their methods, what are their aims, which of the two heirs have they got, and I've also asked you to think about the strengths that they might have. Okay, so what does each side have in their favour? And to think about that, you need to consider who's got the legitimate heir, so how strong is their claimant. Okay, and to consider how strong a claimant is, think about age, think about whether they've been crowned or not, and think about their legitimacy. Those are all valid things you need to consider. Think about their control of territory, think about momentum, think about all of those kind of things to help you work out the strengths. And if you get really stuck, this second task has some strengths on there, so you can look at that to help you work it out. But I think it is relatively straightforward. Your second task then is going to be looking at the reasons why this all kicked off. Okay, now we know that one big reason for it is the issue of the succession, Edgar having too many lady friends, causing kind of murky situations and circumstances around his son's parentage. But arguably that's more of an excuse than a real reason. Okay, there's a lot more going on here. All right, personal problems, as I say. Oswald is particularly hated in Mercia because he took a lot of Alfhere's land. Alfhere wants to kind of get it back. Regionalism, so to what extent is this a kind of Mercia versus East Anglia kind of conflict? Obviously in the past we've seen Mercia in particular really wanting to assert themselves and be an independent kingdom. They've never really liked being second fiddle to Wessex. So how much of that is playing out here? And finally, how far do the strengths of the anti-reform movement drive what's happening? So how much of this is just because they can, effectively? How much of the reason behind all this antics is just because they are able to do so and they have the strength to do so and the opportunity to do so? So when you have sorted those different reasons into those categories, okay, so I'm going to suggest you use colour coding. I would like you for each reason to give it a score out of 10 as to how important you think it was. Okay, so how far does this all happen just because there were some issues with Edgar's marriages? Okay, and as I say, don't forget, I mentioned this last time, but that kind of situation where potentially the parents were a little bit too closely related, that was, it's not okay, it wasn't technically allowed, but at the time it was quite common to keep your lands within the family. Okay, they did do a lot of slightly incestuous marriages to try and ensure that. So it's not that uncommon, but it does tend to be ignored unless people have something to gain from pointing it out. So how much of this is a genuine feeling that, oh, that marriage isn't okay, and how much of it is just, as I say, an excuse to start pursuing some other goals? Okay, so give each of those a score out of 10 for how important you think it was. Okay. What I then want you to do is have a look at that card sort and all the different reasons and the scores you've given. And I would like you to try and write an answer to this question. So, how far was the monastic crisis at the start of Athelred's reign due to the strengths of the anti reform movement? Okay, so how far do you feel this is all happening just because they can? How much is this happening just because the anti reformers have the power to do it and therefore want to do it? Okay, is that a more important reason than the succession? Is that more important than this regionalism that we know has been brewing for a while? Is it more important than personal grievances, personal problems that individuals may have? What do you reckon? And I'm going to ask you to post that answer in Teams so that I can have a look and respond to it, because it's going to kind of be a way of me seeing how well you've done with this work. Okay, so when you've done all that, we need to look at how this story ends. And it ends, well, you remember that first picture that we saw of Edward last lesson, and he had an arrow sticking out of him? The fact that that picture exists and he's called Edward the Martyr probably gives you a fairly good indication of what's going to happen here. He's killed, all right, he's murdered. 978. Okay, he is murdered. He goes to visit his little brother, his little half brother, Athelred. He goes to visit him. He's still living with his mum, so that's Edward's stepmum, Alfrith. He goes round to visit, and he is murdered. He's stabbed to death. Now, as with Edmund all those years ago, our king a little while ago, this murder is never sort of challenged. It's never really followed up on. No one is really publicly accused, and there's no real sort of penance. You have to remember, Edward was actually not a particularly nice person. He was basically a stroppy teenage boy. He was getting on for about 16 at this point, so he's getting to the point where he might be able to rule independently. He had a really bad temper. He was quite sort of aggressive. So he wasn't particularly well liked. Okay, but he had obviously been a useful figurehead as Edgar's son. Now, curiously, when he is murdered, he's buried at Wareham, sort of just down the road. But very shortly after this, he becomes a saint. Okay, now this is in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. No worse deed for the English race was done than this. Men murdered him, but God exalted him. In life he was an earthly king. After death he is now a heavenly saint. Okay, so that sort of came from nowhere. This little boy with a horrible temper who had basically been used by Dunstan and co. to further their agenda is horribly murdered and then venerated as a saint. Okay, so what's going on there? As I say, no one is ever accused for murdering Edward, but obviously someone did, and there's a fair few suspects that we can probably point a finger at fairly convincingly. Okay, so obviously one option is Alfir, the Ealdorman of Mercia, who's been attacking monasteries to regain his land. As soon as Edward dies, that campaign is stepped up. All right, he actively causes quite sort of serious disruption across the kingdom as Mercia is sort of absolutely ravaged by its own ealdorman as he marauds around attacking the monasteries. However, the other two, the pro-reformers, Athelwine of East Anglia, Bertnoth of Essex, they have managed to get that all calmed down. Within a year, it is all finished. Edward's body is dug back up, reburied at Shaftesbury Abbey, a little bit further away, which is much more prestigious. And that seems to be the end of it. Everyone decides to drop things after that. So, who did it? Okay. Got three options, really. One of which is Alfir. Okay, Alfir himself, as we've just said. And the fact that he has to pay for him to be reburied somewhere fancier potentially supports that idea. The other option is Elfrith, so Athelred's mum, Edward's stepmum, okay, the legitimate wife of Edgar. Obviously, she has quite a lot to gain politically here, because if her son's the king, that makes her powerful. You've got to remember, as a woman in the Anglo-Saxon period, unless you're Athelflaed, which is fairly, unlikely, she was a very special case, the only power that women hold is through men. Through their son, through their husband. So if your son is the king, you're in a pretty good position, and there's a good chance that Elfrith may well have had her stepson murdered in order to put her own son on the throne. The other option is Athelred's men. So potentially, as I said, Edward was a little bit of a stroppy boy. There's a chance that he kind of offended people and there was a bit of a scuffle and he ended up being murdered almost by accident. So that's another option. What I'm going to ask you to do is, I've given you a sheet with a bunch of evidence on it. I would like you to use that to complete this table. Now, it doesn't need to be, the most huge detailed table in the world. I just want to know, why would each of these people want him dead? Why would each of these people want to kill Edward? What evidence do we have that they did kill Edward? So, obviously it's all going to be circumstantial. There's no forensic evidence, but what potentially could support that idea? And what is the weaknesses of that evidence? Because as I said, most of the stuff we're looking at here, it's going to be chronicles, it's going to be accounts from the time. As we well know by this point in the course, all of that material is usually subject to some pretty disastrous biases and agendas and issues. So for each of the evidence you're using, I do want you to consider whether we can trust it or not. And the evidence sheet that I've given you will give you that kind of information, so you can use that to help you. When you're done, only decide who you think did it and write an answer. So you don't need to post this on Teams, but I would like you to write an answer down just for your own notes. And there we go. There he is. There's Edward. He's a saint. As I say, he's still a saint now. His saint's day, is the 18th of March. So maybe he closed the schools down for us. I don't know. But there he is. These are his relics. This is at a place called I think it's Brooksworth Abbey, which is in southern England. There's his picture, and supposedly his bones are in this box. They have been dated, and they're the bones of someone who's about 30, so probably not his. But yeah, he is still to this day venerated as a saint by Catholics and Orthodox Church. So that's what they believe in sort of places like Russia and Greece. They see him as a saint who died for his faith. So, why? Okay, a couple of questions just to finish. Why does the life of Oswald describe chaos? Okay, and that is a source that will be on your information sheet. It talks about how after Edward dies, everything goes horribly wrong. And secondly, why is he a martyr? And why would that sort things out? As I said, this is not a boy who has joined the Reformers because he believes in it. This is not like Edgar, who, if you remember, he kind of worked with Dunstan from a young man. He had Athelwold as his tutor, etc. We don't really have any evidence that Edward felt like that. All right, he was a young boy with a horrible temper. There's no real reason to assume he genuinely believed in this stuff. But why was he still turned into a martyr? Okay, and how was that politically helpful for resolving the crisis? Okay, so we know there's been all this infighting, all this civil war, and then it's all kind of wrapped up with a nice little bow, line drawn under it. Everyone moves on when Edward is killed and reburied and then becomes a saint. Why is making him a saint quite helpful for everybody? Okay, if we sort of say, oh well, he died for the cause, the end. Why is that quite beneficial? Because it gives you a bit of a scapegoat, doesn't it? You can say, oh, it's all down to him. Well, he's dead now. Let's move on. So yeah, consider that question. Okay, so let's just finish the story for the end of this lesson. So Athelred is crowned a month later after his brother's murdered. And obviously, as soon as he becomes king, there's kind of a black mark against his name. He's become king as a result of a murder. All right, it's not great, is it? And his coronation is the last major event that Dunstan takes part in. All right, we're quite probably a bit sick of Dunstan at this point. He's been sniffing around for years, and this is his final event. And Dunstan gets a little bit intense at this coronation. Okay, his final kind of public action is that he says to Athelred, look, you know, I'm going to warn you that you became king through violence, through this horrible violent murder, and therefore, very soon, doom is going to befall your kingdom. And then Dunstan goes off to retirement and stops meddling. Interesting. So I think, and then year after Dunstan gives this warning and goes into retirement, the Vikings come back. And as I said, spoiler alert, within sort of 30 years, so just as Athelred dies, the Vikings conquer England, and pretty much everything that all his predecessors had achieved in pushing the Vikings out is undone. So, interesting little superstitious ending there. Okay, what did Dunstan know? Okay, guys, if you have any questions, please let me know. Hopefully, it all makes sense. It's quite a good story, I think. But obviously, drop me an email if you're finding anything tricky, and I will be back with some more work for you next week. Have a lovely bank holiday.